all for joining us and logging in today for this event, Solving Big Problems, Berkeley Psychology in the 21st Century. This, as you know, is part of our ongoing series of events celebrating 100 years of psychology here at UC Berkeley. It's truly exciting to see so many people log on, at the end of the day. So we really appreciate you joining us today. As a wide-ranging scientific discipline, psychology has had and will continue to have an enormous amount to contribute to solving the big problems of today. And the science that our faculty and our students do is no exception to this. Indeed, today we're going to get to hear about the cutting-edge research of 3 of our faculty and how their work contributes to addressing a range of significant problems that people face at the individual level, in their families, at the group level, and at the societal level. Before we get to our wonderful speaker lineup, I want to introduce our wonderful Dean, Dean Raka Ray, who wants to say a few words. Dean Ray leads our Division of Social Sciences, the largest division here at Cal, with 20% of the faculty and 1/4 of student enrollments. And I also want to note that it's the most diverse division of all the divisions here at Cal, representing 15 different programs and units and composed of a relatively diverse faculty and student body. And it's this very diversity in large part that offers scholars and students the opportunity to explore far and wide in their science. So with that, let me turn it over to Raka. Raka?
Thank you, Serena, and welcome, alumni and friends. It gives me so much pleasure to welcome all of you to today's program, which is part of our year-long series celebrating the 100th anniversary of Berkeley Psychology. On behalf of the entire UC Berkeley community, it is also my honor to congratulate the faculty, students, staff, and all of you, the Berkeley Psychology community, on the recent US News and World Report listing of best graduate programs, which once again ranked our department as #1. Alumni and friends are an integral part of Berkeley Psychology's legacy, and the achievements of our students and faculty are not possible without your support. So thank you. Today's incredible lineup of speakers highlights the critical role our research and teaching play in solving problems and in helping people. To help us kick off the event, it's my pleasure to introduce a special recorded message from our Chancellor, Carol Christ, to mark this important milestone.
Welcome to Solving Big Problems, Berkeley Psychology in the 21st Century. Today's program is part of a year-long celebration of the department's 100th anniversary. The latest US News and World Report once again ranked us #1 among US graduate schools, a testament to our impact on society and to you. Whether you're an alum, student, professor, or supporter, you're part of our incredible legacy and partners in our future. Never before has it been more critical to understand the mysteries of the mind and why people do what they do. The pandemic, racial and political unrest, poverty, social media, inequality, these and other factors are making it harder to connect with ourselves and each other, leading to depression, anxiety, sleep disorders, and more. The world needs Berkeley Psychology to help solve those weighty problems and give us tools to understand and strengthen our lives and society. For a century, Berkeley Psychology has expanded our horizons in comprehending the human experience. Our faculty has grown from 4 to 38 members strong, and 20,000 alumni have called the department their intellectual home. Among our research contributions are foundational discoveries in perception, learning, and memory, using advanced neuroimaging technology to find ways to help the brain heal after injury, how infants and young children develop locomotion, emotion, and intuitive theories about the world, how to reduce the stigma of mental illness, how sleep works and its effects on health and disease, and the social, biological, and evolutionary origins of compassion, love, and awe. These contributions do not go unnoticed. Many faculty are members of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and have received Distinguished Scientist or Rising Star awards. Our graduate students are honored with National Science Foundation Research Fellowships. Both groups amass university and national awards for teaching, mentoring, and service. Psychologist Carl Rogers once said, "When I look at the world, I'm pessimistic, but when I look at people, I am optimistic." He suggested that we seek those who boost us up, who shed light on our lives during dark times. Berkeley Psychology, thank you for being light bearers. Fiat Lux, and happy anniversary.
Our thanks to Chancellor Christ. And now to introduce our program, back to Department Chair Serena Chen.
Yeah, thank you so much, Raka, for being here. And we are so grateful for Carol to have her presence here in some way today. So we do have a wonderful lineup. You can see their Zoom screens. We have our three speakers. We're going to start with Professor Robert Knight. We call him Bob. He's a professor of psychology and neuroscience here at Berkeley and a member of our cognitive neuroscience area in our department. In very broad strokes, Bob and his lab, they study the brains of neurological patients to understand the role of human prefrontal cortex in goal-directed behavior and to help the development of neuroprosthetics devices. Today, he's going to tell us about some of his work, highlighting the implications of findings from his lab for health and disease. So Bob, he's going to slowly appear, and there he is. Yes, okay.
So,
take it away.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Chancellor, for your kind words, and Dean Ray for your leadership, and Serena for keeping the herd of cats organized in the psych department. We very much appreciate it. So what I'm going to do today is first share my screen, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what we do in my lab. And share screen. Standard granddaughter picture. And turn off. Oops. Great. Okay, we can get started. So I'm going to talk to you about our work in recording directly from the human brain and what kind of insights that could provide into a host of human behaviors. I just picked a couple. I just want to highlight here one of our great benefactors, Helen Wills Moody, who was a Berkeley undergrad and won Wimbledon 8 times. And she was finally beaten her record by Martina Navratilova, who won 9 times, but Helen Wills Moody never lost a set. She was quite the person. And she kindly helped start the neuroscience initiative here. So first, my main interest is the human frontal cortex and organized behavior. Just as a little preamble, the human prefrontal cortex, it's lateral and it's orbital. When you turn the brain over, expanse is 35% of the cortex. For comparison, a rodent cortex, the frontal cortex is about 1%, a cat's 3%, a dog's 7%, a macaque is probably maybe 15%. So there's been an evolutionary increase, and commensurate with that is the ability of humans to do many complex things: think, plan, organize, decide. Many of those linked to the lateral frontal cortex, and then regulate our social and emotional world linked to orbital frontal cortex. And of course, this is we're trying to understand the normal function, but these areas go awry in disease. So for instance, it's quite common to have damage to frontal cortex from stroke, from brain tumors, from neurodegenerative disorders, many of which are being studied by other people in our department. It's linked to psychiatric disease, particularly schizophrenia, and it's well known from work in many labs and some wonderful work at Berkeley that it's critical for development of normal cognition. If we flip the brain over and look at the undersurface, the orbital frontal cortex, unfortunately frequently injured in car accidents, but really important in how we interact with people, how we perceive people, how we exchange ideas, and for emotional regulation. And again, that area has been linked to obsessive compulsive disease and depression. So you can see there's a very strong link of the lateral frontal cortex, both to straight hardcore neurological disease, and also hardcore major psychiatric disease. And we're going to do a little exploration to give you a feel for what we can do to understand these areas. Now, how do we get direct access to the brain? Well, it's been known since 1929 that you get electrical signals you can pick up in your scalp, the EEG, and I'm sure many of you know about that. But turns out, unfortunately, about 1% of the population has epilepsy in this country. That's a lot of people. That's 3.5 million people. And about 20% of them are what we call medication refractory. That means that we can't control them with meds. And in that particular scenario, what we will do is we'll bring them into one of our collaborating medical centers, and Berkeley grad students and postdocs will go there to study these patients who have electrodes directly implanted either on the surface of the brain, there's 3 patients, or actually with depth electrodes that are robotically targeting key areas that might be epileptic, the amygdala, the orbital frontal cortex, the cingulate cortex. And most of these areas are normal, right? The epileptic brain is not abnormal. There's a site that's abnormal. So we're trying to find that site and then surgically take it out. While the patient is sitting there in the hospital waiting for reproducible seizures and localization so we can go to surgery, basically we can now do cognitive studies, a whole range of studies. And I'll just discuss a couple. So what really got me very excited about this, one of our very early studies, when we just looked at the most simple task, which this is a Berkeley, Eric Edwards is a Berkeley Psych PhD. And early on in 2004, we started doing this work. There were probably then maybe 5 labs doing it internationally. It's become close to a cottage industry now. There's lots of labs, probably well over 100 doing this. This is a very simple task. It's called Verb Generation. And I simply say, and we use it for pre-surgical screening for where language is. You simply say to the patient, I'm going to give you a noun, generate an action verb. So you give the patient ball, they say throw. That's it. And with MRI, which many of you are familiar with, you see these beautiful activations in receptive areas that decode language in the temporal lobe, areas in the frontal cortex, Broca's area that produce the language sequence, and then the motor cortex that actually drives your articulators. And this is beautiful, absolutely beautiful work, but it takes about 4, 5, 6 seconds to get a blood flow response. If you look at direct recording, and here's a patient with electrodes on their brain, you're going to see a two-second movie, because that's how long it takes to go from ball to throw, that I've spread out over 10 seconds. And you might wonder, what are those white electrodes? Those are the ones we determined were linked to epilepsy and we needed to resect. So we're only going to look at the normal electrodes. And here's the code for timing. So this is 1/4 of a second before they hear, let's say, ball. Watch what happens. They hear it, boom, your auditory areas are activated. The information flows to Broca's area. You select the articulatory pattern. You send it to your motor cortex. You say the word, you hear it, you redrive your auditory cortex. It's all done in 1.5 seconds or less. This is the only technique that can really precisely track the spatial temporal dynamics of human behavior. And this was a very exciting first finding. It took us a while to get it published because people thought, why not just do fMRI, which is wonderful, but this gave us a temporal parameter. So let's see how we could use it for frontal lobe activity, which is my lab's main research area. How does your frontal cortex and its subdivisions produce goal-directed human behavior? This is another grad student, Matar Haller. She was a Helen Wills neuroscience grad student. She did an epic task where she recorded from 16 subjects in 38 different sessions. These are all being recorded in the ICU. And by the way, our trainees do the recording. They actually go to the hospital, stay there and record. She had a series of tasks, real easy tasks. You show a stimulus of face, male or female. Little bit harder, word repetition. I say tree, you say tree. Even harder, I say happy. Are you happy? Yes or no? All the way up to a really hard task, antonym generation. I say cool, you say hot. And these are the reaction times. It gets harder and harder and harder. So what happens? These are the yellow electrodes, are all the electrodes that when we record show this unique high-frequency brain activity that's in the 100 hertz range. Think about that. It's 100 cycles per second, and it's a precise, exquisite measure of local cortical activation, and it's linked to actually single cell firing in the underlying cortex. So it's a very powerful tool. Let me show you Matar's results. So not so surprisingly, when you let's say I show you a picture and say, is it male or female, and you get visual activation, or I say to you a word and say, repeat it, you get auditory activation. Fine. That's just sensory. Here's when the person responded. Maybe they pressed a button, maybe they said male, female. And here over here in this corner is when they responded. This line here is actually the speed of response. So here's a fast response, a medium response, a slow response. And this is the single trial activity. One little trial of doing one of her tasks stacked. There's probably 1,000 trials here. And you see, not so surprisingly, when they respond, motor cortex is activated. But what's the glue? What's the glue that links perception and action? A decades, maybe century-long question. If you look here and you look here, you see, independent of a fast or a slow response, you see robust activation in the lateral prefrontal cortex, the glue of cognition. It doesn't matter what the task was. You saw the 8 different tasks. It's necessary to accomplish every one of them. And here in this simple movie, you can see what happens. Here's a simple task, word repetition. I say humid, you say humid. You're going to see this activity unfold in real time on the brain, and you'll see the red area that comes on is the frontal cortex. That's the thing that's deciding and implementing you saying humid. And let's just take a peek at that. Red, over, press the button, blue, done. Or say the word humid. Now let's use humid again as the cue. It's going to activate the same auditory area, but this time you have to do antonym generation. A whole lot harder, a whole lot longer reaction time. But now you're going to see the glue, the frontal cortex, come on, and stay on. It's on, it's on, it's on, continuously, and then you respond. Now, I could show you other things from orbital frontal cortex related to gambling and things. We've done gambling tasks. And as I mentioned briefly, these patients with damage there are often impulsive, and you'll hear more about that in Sheri's talk, but maybe that's for another time. We did have identified a regret signal that you have if you make a bad bet or you're losing money. And we have some ideas that a lack of this regret signal in the orbital frontal cortex may be linked to addiction and compulsive gambling. Again, time for another time. This is some beautiful work by Ji Zhang, who is a PhD in bioengineering in the lab. She's now a postdoc at MIT, a wonderful young scientist. And for those this is basically looking at the medial part of the brain. Here's the hippocampus. This is the area key for laying down new memory. No hippocampus, no new learning, no new memory. And then sitting right in front of it is this beautiful little red structure, the amygdala. Probably some of you have heard about that because that's the emotion decoder in the brain. It's a little bit like your ears and your auditory cortex analyze sound, your visual cortex vision. Your amygdala extracts emotional valence. Anger, sad, happy, etc., fear. Now, the question, you all know that if something emotional happens, you remember it better. How does that happen? What's going on? How does the amygdala interact, decoding that it was a happy scene, maybe a birthday or something like that, or maybe something bad, an accident? How does it encode it? How does it get it into the hippocampus? So here's a blow up. The yellow is the amygdala. The blue is the hippocampus, and these are all our recording electrodes. And she did a series of studies. I'll just show you one, where she showed the patients neutral stimuli, landscapes, not much emotional there. And then for comparison, she showed the same patients fearful faces, well known to activate the amygdala. What goes on, basically? Well, what goes on is this. The amygdala decodes the fear stimulus and then transmits it through synchronized neural activity between the amygdala driving the hippocampus so that you remember those emotional scenes. And it's a very powerful mechanism, and it explains really why you remember emotional things. And this circuit goes awry in multiple psychiatric disorders, particularly things such as anxiety disorders, where there's a dysregulation, and in post-traumatic stress disorder. So this provides a window into the real physiology of how your brains work, and provides an infrastructure of how we may approach it to modulate it or change the connectivity and perhaps ameliorate some of the devastating neuropsychiatric disorders that affect human beings. Now I'm going to switch completely to the last thing, which is, again, because I want to focus on ability, what are translational? What can we do translational? Well, we could regulate the amygdala hippocampal axis. We could boost up the lateral frontal cortex in aging. What about a speech prosthetic device? And as you all know, there's unfortunate patients who have severe problems with, for instance, Lou Gehrig's disease. They can't speak, aphasia, and other severe nonverbal apraxia and autism spectrum disorder. Can we develop a way for patients who can't speak where we could decode what they want to say so that they could speak? They could talk to their loved ones. They could say, I'm hungry, I love you, whatever they want to say. So this is work by another PhD student in the lab, Chris Holgraf. And this was done in collaboration with Frederick Tunison, a wonderful colleague who's a world expert in the psychology department in acoustics and sound. And he collaborated on this. And basically what you're going to hear, I think it's a remarkable effect. And it points out how rapidly plastic the brain can reorganize. And we know that the brain is very plastic. It can reorganize if you just think of cochlear implants. If you lose your hearing, you lose your hair cells, there's 25,000 of them, you can't hear, and you put a cochlear implant in, it's got 64 contacts, not 25,000. And it stimulates the basilar membrane of the cochlea in 64 places. And you'd say, how could that ever be decoded? Well, guess what? The brain over a couple of weeks takes that restricted information and it can hear. And this shows you just how fast this happens. So what you're going to hear from Chris's work is you're going to hear a sentence where using Frederick's methodology, we've extracted from the sentence the linguistic components that make an intelligible speech. And then right after you hear this, you're going to hear the actual sentence that was there. And now we're going to play you the same exact stimulus that before you couldn't understand before. And what's going to happen is you're going to now, in 1 to 2 seconds, change your brain firing pattern and be able to extract from this noise actually the sentence structure at a rapid scale, much faster than even a cochlear implant. So let's listen to this. There'll be a couple sentences.
Bagpipes and bongos are musical instruments. Bagpipes and bongos, musical instruments. The high security prison was surrounded by barbed wire. The high security prison was surrounded by barbed wire. The high security prison was surrounded by barbed wire.
The full moon shone brightly that night. Move the garbage nearer to the large window.
I hope you all got that effect. Remember, what you're hearing here, and you could make out the sentence after the context is put in between, is the exact same stimulus you heard here. Your brain, in a second, retunes. This really tells us that there's a tremendous opportunity to develop neuroprosthetic devices that can decode your thoughts, your intention to speak. So we did a study, and this is a study with Brian Paisley, who actually is now at Apple. Some of our trainees actually go into industry. And over here, Eddie Chang, who there was a little bit younger. This was in 2009 when this project started. He's now the chair of neurosurgery. And I should mention, he's been a leader in developing invasive techniques for treatment of depression with intracranial stimulation in the orbital frontal cortex. And that, again, is a story for another day. This is an old study, but I thought, it's the first one, so it's kind of fun to see. The patients hear 100 words. So let's say this is baseball. We record from their brain with these grids. We extract this signal, this high frequency activity, which is a reflection of neural firing. We come up with a reconstruction model to try to fit each electrode to a different frequency to match the spectrogram of what they heard. Now, for those of you who know about this kind of work, if you have enough freedom in your reconstruction model, you could turn an elephant into a tsetse fly. So the fact that you could make this fit this doesn't mean anything unless you test it on a data set that was not used to create the model. Eddie and Brian held out 20, 30 stimuli that were not in the initial data set. And then they saw, can I decode those 30 words with this model? And lo and behold, they had 92% accuracy. It was really quite stunning, really laying the infrastructure for development of neuroprosthetic devices. So what they're trying to do is really read the notes of the brain. Can I put this electrode and hook it up at a certain time period with a certain frequency? And they were highly successful. And I'll play some of their early work. You're going to hear what the patient heard, 4 words. These are different patients being recorded. 4 words spoken, and then 4 words reconstructed directly from brain activity.
Waldo. Structure. Doubt. Property.
So I think you can see, it's an initial study. It's a little rough, but we can actually reconstruct the sound that you heard. And the next phase, of course, is can we reconstruct when you imagine the word, not that you just heard it? And the answer is yes. And again, I don't have time to go into that. I just want to show you the initial data saying that the ability, when you bring together people who are doing neuroscience, computational engineering, the sky's really the limit. So I'll conclude with just one last thing, because I think this is most salient to actually what Jason's going to talk about, is why can't people understand each other? Why can't I communicate an idea to somebody? Why do we have such divisiveness and social dysfunction? Well, obviously, it's because we're not listening and not understanding. So the question is, can we use direct brain recording to actually understand, as I try to infer to you my ideas about something, language or some form of social interaction? Can I detect what I'm trying to communicate to you, how a brain of the receiver actually decodes this information? It sounds a little bit crazy. It's been done with dual MRI scan, but again, doing it with intracranial recording takes us down into this really close to the cellular level with precise temporal accuracy. And I'm not going to show you any data. We've just started this. We're really excited about it. It's kind of crazy. This was I was called by a grad student and a postdoc from Berkeley. They were recording from a patient at Irvine. And they said, hey, Bob, we've got 2 patients. And what test should we run on each patient? I said, well, do this and this, but why don't you wire them together and actually do some of our social communication tasks, which we previously had been done in just one patient communicating with a hospital personnel. And they said, hey, this is we can't get that organized. I remember I said to them, come on, your Berkeley PhD and postdoc, figure it out. So about 4 hours later, they said we just got back from Fry's Electronics, and sure enough, they'd wired everything together, and they started doing studies on how 2 people transfer information and transfer knowledge. Anais is now taking this over. She loves her wires, and she loves her duct tape, because this were 2 patients on opposite sides of the room, of a hallway, and the nurses didn't want wires on the floor, so she had to duct tape it. We've gotten better. We're not that crude anymore. We can now do it on the internet. We can do it between hospitals because we have a GPS locator. But I think this kind of research will begin to unravel, what's the healthy way to communicate? Because I think, as you'll see in Jason's talk, there's a lot of things that need to be repaired. So with that, I'll conclude. This is just some of the people who've been through the lab, really, just wonderful across the board. They're all moving on in their careers. I showed you data from 3 or 4 of them. And for the trainees out there, say, my God, how am I going to have a life? How am I going to be a successful scientist? And I'll just show you what this slide I like a lot. This is called our intracranial kids. This is different people in the lab, and they're different kids that they've had while they were in the lab. So, and Deborah just had number 4, by the way. So anyway, I will stop there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Bob. Okay, I meant to say this before Bob spoke, but I'll say it now. We are taking questions from the audience. So if you have any, please submit it using the Q&A tab. We prefer that over the chat. We have about 5 or 6 minutes if you want to ask Bob any sort of follow-up question. I do have one that was already submitted that I can read off. So Bob, could you please enlighten us about the clinical potentials of photobiomodulation and hyperbaric oxygen therapy in dementia and other kinds of cognitive impairment?
Well, hyperbaric oxygen has been touted as a treatment for a lot of diseases, and my read on that is I'm not convinced by the data. Basically, I don't think there's really been a good clinical trial that shows it's efficacious. The idea is if you really put someone in a high oxygen content, you're going to improve healing. It is true for certain, like if you have a burn, let's say a burn patient's going to work, but I don't think there's any clear evidence of any effect on cognitive dysfunction. I think, and I don't, let's pick an example. Aging. Aging is well known to be associated with problems with your lateral frontal cortex. I think the more proper thing is to think of some way to actually develop stimulation protocols. I just don't see hyperbaric oxygen being a viable tool now. Again, that's my opinion, but I try to base my opinion on the literature, basically.
Okay. Another question?
Please.
Could I actually ask just for a little 3 more sentences on that last part about the hooking 2 people up? I saw Jason's face as you were talking about this, and as we're both social psychologists, it's blowing our minds that you've developed this kind of technology. Can you just say 2 or 3 more sentences in lay terms about what this opens up in terms of being able to study? A little bit more concrete. Yeah.
Okay, so we have 2 studies going right now. And again, you need 2 patients. And we started with 2 patients in the same hospital, but that doesn't happen a lot. Usually there's 1 patient being monitored. But now we recorded 6, actually we recorded UCSF, California Pacific Medical Center, UC Davis, UC Irvine, UCSD, Loma Linda, Washington University, and Oslo. That's too far away in time zone. But we have come up with a GPS system that we can precisely link people with 20 millisecond accuracy, which we need. Okay, so what are we doing? We're doing a language inference task where I'm trying to communicate to you simply whether I'm thinking about what kind of animal or what kind of non-animal, and is it big or is it large? Really simple. And then we have a nonverbal social communication task right now where I'm trying to show you on a game board what I think the solution is, and you have to try to figure out. And what we've seen is when people start to figure things out, their orbital frontal cortex and their cingulate begin to become in sync. It's really quite remarkable. The one that I want to do, but only because of personal interest, I think if what's the most social game you could play would be, Texas Hold'em. So we're actually thinking of implementing a poker task between people. But we're, if you guys think of something you want to do, hey, I'm all ears. I mean, we're completely. I mean, I would love it the more you guys got involved. Amazingly, the NIH just funded this. I thought they would probably say it's too wacky, but they didn't. So,
okay.
Away
Okay, we
we
have
go.
time for a couple more, I think, before we move on to our next speaker. We have one from the audience. Would you describe ADD as a consequence of a lack of neurocommunication among different cerebral areas?
I think that that's a fair statement. I think if you look at ADHD, if you try to summarize all literature, and of course I don't think you can say it's just one thing, it's a spectrum, but most of the studies show that the maturation of the frontal lobe it's not in sync, and its control capability of regulating information flow is not there. So things that are normally, if you're navigating the environment, you'd like to stay focused and not be distracted. And that's one of the beautiful things your frontal lobe does. I didn't show you any of that data. We've done a lot of attention research where you can focus on something and inhibit the distractors. And I think that's one of the core problems in ADHD. And again, it gets back to this idea that your frontal lobe is the orchestrator of cognition. The frontal lobe is connected bidirectionally to virtually every structure in the brain. So it gets information and it can send information out. And I think it is a connectivity issue. I think most high-level problems of the kind that Jason studies or Sheri studies or you study are connectivity issues. The network is off. One of the other things we've been doing quite a bit of research on is, and I didn't really think of this till I had a really talented postdoc arrive 5 years ago. Half our acting day is mind wandering. Probably half the audience, maybe they're mind wandering now, right? You go from focused attention to internal thought. And we've actually worked out the physiology of the networks that control the internal or external thought. We're now trying to figure out the switching between the two. It has huge implications for your area research, because you can have internal thoughts that are ruminating, which are bad in terms of depression. You can have internal thoughts that are free form, that are great for creativity. So I think it's a wide open area, and it has to do with large discrete brain areas being connected and interacting. And that's what we really try to get at.
Okay, we actually have time for maybe one more question that's related to what you're just talking about. The question is, it's related to your comments about network, but also connected to other areas. Could you give us your opinion how specialized you think the brain is? That is, are things super localized, or does the brain work as a giant network of coordinated activity?
Well, I think that's a fundamental and great question. The closer you get the primary sensory area, the auditory cortex, the motor cortex, move your hand, feel your touch, the visual cortex, that's very modular. It's conserved across species. And they're even hierarchical areas. Of course, we have people in our department doing incredible work on face processing. There's a face processing network in the ventral stream. Those are pretty tight if you want to be frontological. But even the face area is controlled by frontal cortex. Mark Desposito's lab has shown you can either switch between your face area and your place area, or your object area. So I think as soon as you get away from very early sensory flow areas, it becomes a distributed network. And I don't want to make that sound like, we'll never figure out what it is. I don't think that's true. I think we have the tools to dissect out these control networks, and it's going to be fundamental to understanding not only what we do in normal in normal life, but really what goes awry in a whole range of things, the kind of thing that, Sheri and her colleagues are interested in, the kind of work you're going to hear from Jason. I think we're just on you look at the newspaper and you think we know everything. We don't know a lot. And I think that's really great for all the young people. The big questions of how the brain is organized are out there, and there will be figured out.
Well, that is a great way to segue into Sheri, actually. Thank you so much, Bob. And for those of you who submitted questions to Bob, we'll save this chat and pass it on to the speakers, because we do need to stay with the program. So I am going to turn to introducing Sheri, Professor Sheri Johnson. She's a professor in our department and a member of our clinical sciences area. Broadly speaking, Sheri's work, she's focused on two main themes in her research, on reward sensitivity and on emotion-related impulsivity. Today, as the title of her talk suggests, she's going to focus on the latter, telling us about her work and how it contributes to understanding and managing impulsivity. Sheri.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here and the chance to share a little bit about our work. Oops, there we go. All right. So people have been pondering impulsivity for a very long time. There are writings that suggest that by the 2nd millennium BC, the Babylonians had a festival that involved rituals that were an attempt to deal with gaining control over impulses. I'm going to fast forward a little and focus on some of the innovations I think that have come out in the last 10 years or so that I think are giving us a little more traction. I think one of the innovations that really helped this field was to begin to recognize that impulsivity is not a thing. It's a lot of things. There are many different traits, and they may be related to each other, but that it's important to pull them apart and look at them separately. The part of it that I really want to focus in on is something we call emotion-related impulsivity. Now, if you're like me, you hear that term and you think, oh gosh, do I have that? Because I think for almost all of us, there's a sense that when we're angry or upset, it's much easier to say or do things we regret. And we often wake up the next day with a sense of remorse about that. But imagine you're a person who's haunted by that every day, maybe even several times a day, where, even a mild shift in your emotions and all of a sudden you feel like you're not the person you want to be. Those are the folks we're interested in, is where it's a really chronic and recurrent problem for them that's more extreme and more present in their life. It's pretty easily measured. Whiteside and Lynham developed a scale called the UPS that asks really straightforward questions, like when I'm upset, I often act without thinking. Those items were about negative emotions, but it turns out that people also often endorse problems with positive emotions. Like when I'm very happy, I tend to do things that may cause problems in my life. So we can give people a score on both of these. Think of it as a continuum. And it turns out that the very same people who report a lot of problems with negative emotions usually report a lot of problems with positive emotions. The two are very closely correlated. And that's why I like to think of it more generally as emotion-related impulsivity, because it's good and bad emotions. It's been a hot concept. There have been now over 1,200 publications on this topic. And I want to give you a little feel for why I think people are so excited about it. I think probably the most profound part of this is that emotion-related impulsivity, compared to any other self-rated form of impulsivity, has been shown to kind of much more robustly, much more strongly predict many, many troubling outcomes in the mental health field, whether you want to talk about aggression, alcohol or substance use problems, binge eating, risky sexual behavior, gambling, depression, self-harm, suicidality. It's more predictive of who's going to have these problems. So where do we jump into this? What has my team done? We've been kind of focused on several different puzzles. And the first puzzle was, does this help us in understanding mood disorders? And in early work, we were able to show that emotion-related impulsivity was quite high compared to the general population for people who had major depression, people who had bipolar I disorder, and even people at high risk for bipolar disorder. I think more importantly, though, we were able to show that this form of impulsivity helped us understand many of the troubling outcomes that happen in mood disorders. So people with mood disorders, the extent to which they had high emotion-related impulsivity helped us understand how much self-harm they would engage in, the degree of suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, aggressive outbursts, quality of life, and their overall satisfaction with key domains in their life. So it seemed important. It seems important across disorders. It seems important for key life domains. But the real struggle has been, what the heck is emotion-related impulsivity? What drives it? Why do some people struggle with this more than other people? The first thing you might wonder, and we certainly did and started tackling this question, was whether it's just people having more intense emotions. And so one way to look at that is to bring people into the lab and try and induce an emotion by having people watch intense film clips, or giving them failure, or giving them stresses, like having them do a speech. And we can measure what they say they feel. We can look at their facial expressions. We can measure psychophysiology, like their heart rate. There's even studies in the scanner. Bob mentioned the amygdala. Thank you. Well, the answer is no. They're not more emotional per se. They don't look like they're having a more powerful emotional state. So still, what is it? What we think is happening is that when these folks are in a state of high emotion, there's some kind of dysregulation that happens. And the real puzzle is, what's that dysregulation that allows for things like aggression or regrettable behavior to come out? So what's interesting is that if you bring people into the lab, even though they won't say they're feeling more emotion after, and won't look like they're having a bigger emotion when you induce a mood state, you will see that they're more symptomatic. So if you do a negative mood induction, they're more likely to, say, eat the cookie when they're on a diet. They're more likely to drink more alcohol if that's being served. But you see the very same thing if you do a positive mood induction, where they're more likely to gamble, they're more likely to drink. So again, it's not about whether they're in a good or bad mood, it's that they're in some kind of emotion state. And so we've really begun to think about what could be driving a loss of control during these kind of high arousal emotion states. For that, we've turned to a series of neuroimaging and behavioral studies. And I'm not going to tell you about all the ways we went wrong and all the theories we had that didn't work. We have a lot of things that haven't worked. But one thing that has worked in a lot of studies is to look at this idea of response inhibition, because it seems like that's a real neurocognitive problem area for folks that have this kind of emotion-related impulsivity. So I'll just give you a brief example of a response inhibition task. Let's say Bob comes in my lab and I want to test his response inhibition. I ask him to press a button as quickly as he can every time a light comes on. And he does that for maybe 100 times. But now I tell him that if the light has a different color, he can't press the button. His ability to keep himself from pressing the button in that kind of, when the new signal comes on the screen, is our index of his response inhibition. So we see that emotion-related impulsivity is tied to problems with response inhibition. It's particularly a problem for people when we test like clinical mental health related samples. And I think that's because they have more likely higher ranges of this form of impulsivity. People also struggle a lot more if we test this after a mood induction, so it's related to their emotion state, or if something on the screen or in the task itself involves an emotion-related stimulus. Now, why am I fascinated by response inhibition? Well, I'm fascinated by it because here's a meta-analysis of the brain regions that are involved when somebody engages in response inhibition effectively. And here's a meta-analysis of key brain regions that are involved when we engage in a certain kind of emotion regulation where we're using reappraisal. We're asking people to rethink the situation that upset them. Both heavily demand frontostriatal circuitry that's then involved in downstream regulation of the amygdala. So can we use this for treatment? And why would I want to? Well, people have tested a lot of different medications as potential treatments for impulsivity. I don't think the results look good. There's also been decades of people trying to help people with psychotherapy, and most commonly by saying, let's help you slow down and rethink the situation. That's exactly the brain circuitry that's going to be a challenge for folks that have this. That's probably one of the most difficult things you could ask them to do. So maybe that's not a good match. And so not surprisingly, our treatments are pretty poor for impulsivity. They don't work that well. So can we help the field do a little better? Well, we certainly can help people think, okay, where you need to focus in is when you're really feeling a state of high emotion. We can give them techniques that don't rely on response inhibition or emotion regulation. Don't just try and stop yourself from doing this. Don't try and reappraise the situation. And to the extent that during these moments, they're going to have weaker frontostriatal circuitry, we think practice is really going to matter because they're going to have to learn these skills really well. So what do we do in our simple straight ahead cognitive behavioral treatment? We explain to people what emotion-related impulsivity is. We have them learn to really self-monitor to identify high states of emotional arousal, triggers for those. We have them learn different self-calming strategies and practice those, and then engage in daily monitoring to see how those coping strategies are working for them to reduce their impulsivity. It's so straight ahead, we do it online, but then to help people practice, we send them phone pings 4 times a day, getting them to think about their emotions and their coping. That gives us a lot of data from those daily logs, and we can use that to help them plan what works best for them. Now, how did we test this out? We wanted a really clear behavioral target. So we chose aggression because that's one of the kind of crisp outcomes from emotion-related impulsivity. So we wanted to catch people who, when they were in a state of negative emotion, tended to be aggressive. We recruited people who were both high on emotion-related impulsivity and high on aggression. On average, people were reporting more than 4 times a week. They were having aggressive outbursts, and about 12% of them were having legal problems from their aggression. Compared to waitlist control, we looked at interview scores, we looked at self-report scores, and during waitlist control, we didn't really see movement in either kind of measure of aggression. But once people took part in the intervention, we saw nice drop-offs in their aggression, whether it was based on their report or our interviews. And most excitingly, people felt like they were still doing better 3 months later. We've also looked at this in a small group of people who said they were struggling with aggression in the context of bipolar disorder. We saw very parallel effects there. So it's early, but what does this open the door for? I think on the whole, what we really want to do is do the kind of research that tells us what mechanisms are going awry, and then use that to turn around and create better treatments. And the thing we're most excited about is that if emotion-related impulsivity is related to all of these outcomes, can we target emotion-related impulsivity and make a difference in a really broad range of mental health problems? So that's where we're headed. That's what we're trying to kind of figure out. And I want to give thanks because this takes a lot of people. So these are all faculty members that are part of Berkeley that have been hugely helpful to us in collaborating and trying to understand pieces. In white are our students and our team members, and then these are people from outside of the university who've just been core for us. And I really do welcome questions and suggestions and ideas and collaborations.
Thanks so much, Sheri. We do have some questions. I'm going to start with one. Does age factor into treatments? For example, is it more or less effective the subject is at an older or younger developmental stage?
It's a great question. So part of the reason it's a great question is because adolescence is sort of peak years for impulsivity, and you know that if you're a parent. So impulsivity increases during adolescence, and then it tends to get better over time. So have hope, have faith that, as you get older, you tend to become less impulsive. That's good for all of us to know. But with this, we tested this initially in adults, and we've been moving now to kind of develop intervention programs for adolescents. And we've been collaborating with a lot of adolescent psychologists, clinical psychologists, and they're forcing us to tailor this a fair amount. They want it to be less work. They don't want the kids to have to be as patient. But at the same time, the kids are more likely to kind of be willing to engage in technology like cell phones. Thanks to Allison Harvey, who's really expert on treatment development with adolescents, and she's helped us think a little bit about things like, you better make your texts cute. If you're going to ping people 4 times a day and they're 15 years old, you better not be boring in the way that we get away with being to adults. So we're working towards, what do you need to do to change this for younger populations? And we'll see. That's one of our next goals.
Okay, another question with the comment first, amazing research with so many profound implications, but wondering if people who have emotion-related impulsivity, are they able to distinguish positive and negative emotion states from other high arousal states like hunger or an adrenaline surge? And if these non-emotional states are also linked to impulsive behavior, response inhibition, and so forth.
I feel like that question, whoever planted that question should be, I just want to give them a hug, because we worked on this for like 10 years without thinking about that question, because everybody in the field was busy focusing on, wow, there's these people who lose control during states of high emotion. And we just started to wonder about a year ago, I wonder if they also are more likely to react badly when they're sleepy, when they're hungry, when they're distracted, when they're, how many conditions lead to a kind of fragile response inhibition, neurocortical, frontal striatal circuitry for them. So we just started creating a questionnaire to look at that. We've given it to maybe 400 people, and it's on the docket for this summer to get back to looking at that question and kind of understand how narrow is this profile, because we realized in all of our excitement about the idea that it happens after emotions, we really haven't tested the water of how many other times in life does it happen for these folks. Stay tuned.
Okay, another question. First, this is so interesting. I'd love to hear about your thinking on the link between emotion-related impulsivity and mindfulness, or more specifically, non-reactance.
I love this question. There's a single study that's done a 1-hour mindfulness kind of intervention with people and showed that people felt like they had better control after that single hour of not going ahead and leaping into the kind of impulse-driven or emotion-driven impulse. So I think there's a lot of potential there. When we did our intervention, we had a lot of thoughts about what kinds of self-calming strategies we should hand people. And what we learned is that almost everybody had a self-calming strategy they liked. And most people wanted to practice that strategy more than be told what's the strategy that we should assign them. So there's a million ways you can help calm yourself, right? You can do relaxation, you can do meditation, you can do exercise, you can take 3 deep breaths, you can leave the room and try and, disengage. And most people gravitated towards something that already they had kind of intuitively chosen. And even though we tried to teach lots of different kind of self-calming strategies, many people said, now I want to go back to the one that I was using and get more used to just plugging it in at the key time. So that's a really interesting puzzle. How much should we be assigning a self-calming strategy, and how much should we be enhancing people plugging it in the moments when they really need to? I'd love to work with people who are training on meditation and just see naturalistically, does that already, without much tinkering, change emotion-related impulsivity? Like, I think this is a natural thing to plug into kind of other studies of meditation. So
Terrific. Thank you so much, Sheri. And again, we will make sure that the speakers get the other questions in the chat. We are going to need to move on. I want to stay true to our time frame here. I'm delighted to introduce, last but certainly not least, Professor Jason Okonofua, who's an assistant professor in our department and a member of our social personality psychology area. Broadly speaking, Jason's research program examines social psychological processes that contribute to inequality in various domains, as well as how we can harness ideas and tools of social psychology to reduce bias and prejudice. Today, he's going to focus on the latter, talking about sidelining bias, the situationist approach he takes in his research on reducing the consequences of bias in real-world contexts. Jason?
Thank you so much for the great introduction. My presentation might not be that great because I'm still like thinking through the work that my colleagues have going on. We stay in touch, but oh my gosh, they stay so busy. And I think it's really cool that there's a lot of intersections of our work, absolutely. And maybe you all can pinpoint some of them. But to start, I revised my slides a little bit from Bob's presentation. So this is my daughter, Ada, and just to give some life to the research and the numbers. Everything I'm going to present today has been created since she came into the world. And the citations, if anyone's interested, you can go through them and you might find secretly embedded her name in all of them. So I like to start my lectures with something light because things about bias and stereotyping can be felt as quite negative, and that's something I'll touch on as we think about viable solutions to what we can do on a societal level to address the consequences of bias. And so start with a quote. This is from Walt Whitman in the Song of Myself, in which he said, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." And this really captures a lot of classic social psychological research that basically states or shows that each individual, we have multiple identities, we have multiple selves, we have multiple goals. And that's something that I'll be coming back to in a real critical part of the theory of my work is that if we know that, then we can become the architects of context and create context in which biased selves are less likely to rear their head or take hold over our behavior. And that more pro-social and productive professional goals and selves can actually do the work without all of the pushback that is seen in the real world practices of trying to do away with people's biases. And so just quickly, bias is a term that I use that encompasses like 3 different levels of the thing. There's stereotyping, which is like a mental association that happens in the brain that connects an idea or a statement or a thought with a group. And so that's on the cognitive level. And then on the affective or emotional level, there's things are more commonly understood as prejudice or attitudes that we have. That's our belief system. And then there's discrimination, which is how we actually treat people. And in the legal sense, it's when there's a fundamental difference in how people are treated at the foundation and also in the outcome. And that these are all important things to consider when going out into the field and understanding institutions and structures in place, and to then think about how can you take a psychological approach to shift the outcomes in those settings. And so trying something a little different with giving presentations, in which I'm going to start with the lead. What I'm going to show you today at the end is that this type of approach has led to a 13% reduction in recidivism for adults going back to prison. It's led to a 60% reduction in recidivism for youth or children going back to juvenile detention. And it has led to a 45% reduction in the racial disparities and suspensions that remove children from the learning environment, as well as a 50% reduction in overall suspension rates across multiple school districts. And so why, but how is this possible? It's taking a very strategic and science-based method of understanding the problem space, thinking about the entire or the holistic situation, and then pinpointing key areas where if you make a very targeted tweak in how we think about the things that are happening around us, that we can ultimately bring about large and scalable and lasting improvements in society at large. And so you've probably heard of implicit bias trainings or diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings that have become very popular in industry. However, from the scientific community, we may not have done a good enough job of letting the public know just how limited these could be. Please don't be taken aback by all the dots and text on this slide. The whole point is that there has been research that shows that these type of approaches are not very effective or long lasting. For example, here you're seeing the results from a intervention tournament in which they tried some of the most intuitive and theory-based approaches to get rid of people's bias, to de-bias them. And the red dotted line is what's accepted across the social sciences as what would be a minimal effect or a weak effect. And what you're seeing is that at best, there's a weak effect. And then follow-up research by these same authors showed that even that effect only lasts something like 24 hours to 36 hours, meaning that if you're at work and there's an implicit bias training, you can go into it. And if you look at the ones lower on this list, it can actually backfire and you can leave that setting with more bias, or in this case specifically, anti-Black bias. And that when you then leave that session and go on with your day, commute home, get home, that by then being exposed to all types of sources of stereotypes, that implicit bias can return. And that's where we are now. And it's no offense to like anyone. It was a meta-analysis that was done just last year that showed that looking at 418 experiments over the past 3 decades has shown that efforts to get rid of people's prejudice or bias have been mixed, weak, and short-lived. And so that's the landscape. But let me tell you about what we've been doing at Berkeley. And so as a social psychologist and thinking about this situation, when we think about just getting rid of people's bias or de-biasing them, it's us thinking about the person and trying to interpret that person and why they're doing or thinking the things that they are. And what we do a lot in social psychology is think about the situation around that person. Think about how multiple people interact, similar to what Bob was talking about connecting people. Thinking about what the environment is in which these people come together and what their goals and selves might be, which is what I will be coming back to and focusing on. And then also what that means for the impulses that then come from those goals and selves, similar to what Sheri was talking about. And so this is based in classic psychology or social psychology that just hasn't been or hadn't been applied as much as we would like it to be to this particular context of bias. And so this is an image from the very famous work by Sharif and Sharif in the Robber's Cave, in which they had children come to a camp, and there were the eagles and the rattlers, I believe they were, in which they very quickly became very competitive and had bias against each other. These are young boys, and that a lot of times that's where that research ends. That's what people's understanding of that work was. However, there was a whole other chapter of that book and how they brought those groups back together without necessarily getting rid of their bias towards each other, but instead elevating their superordinate goals or creating a situation in which they had to work together to reach a goal that was beneficial for all of them. And that's something that inspired this work. And I think you'll see that that's a common theme through these different projects or experiments that we've run. And so the theory or the idea is that we can sideline bias or elevate context-based goals or elevate professional goals in a way that renders bias not functional. And so if you think about trains, if there's a problematic car on the train, you sideline that particular car so that the entire train can still get to its destination. If you think about the NBA Finals right now, which I know Bob and I think about, which he's a Warriors fan, I'm a Memphis fan. They're probably going to go at it soon. Yeah, I see you, Bob. But if you think of the self, of yourself as a team, there's certain players that are not ideal at certain times, and that it's important to put that player on the sideline so that you can still win the game. And so that's the idea. That's the theory here. And so just again, to make it clear, the treatment across these different projects that I'm going to present now is that we elevate context-based goals. Those contexts differ. The people in those contexts differ. The outcomes differ. But the specific outcome of interest is not the bias itself. It's not getting rid of people's bias, which indeed research should continue to look at how we can do that type of work. It's a very tall order. But rather the outcome is the consequences of the bias. How do we actually create equity in real world context? And that's something I foreshadowed in the results that we have. And so to start, I'm going to walk through the theory in terms of one of those projects, namely the suspensions in K through 12 education. And so across the United States, there has been an explosion of suspensions and expulsions, but namely suspensions. Suspensions are when a student is removed from the learning environment for any number of hours or days. And it is a punitive disciplinary response. It was initially put into place due to zero tolerance policies, or for zero tolerance policies, to be a deterrent against school violence or bringing guns to school. However, what it became is that the overwhelming majority of suspensions are for something that's more subjective in nature, more interpersonal, things that are termed willful defiance in California, disrespect elsewhere, insubordination elsewhere. And the thing that you can think about and that we understand in psychology is that those are ambiguous terms. If I were to ask everyone here, what does disrespect look like? We would probably get 70 different answers because it's open to interpretation of what that means. I'm half Nigerian and half American. The American side of me says that when an adult's talking to you, you look them in the eye as a show of respect. The Nigerian side of me says that when an adult is talking to you, you look down as a sign of respect. It's open, it's subjective in nature. And we also know that those are the type of situations, that's the type of context in which stereotypes inform how we respond to other people. And so it seems like this is a situation that was ripe for that, but indeed, what is the case is that Black students make up about 14% of the 14% of the students in schools throughout the United States. However, they make up about 40% of the students who are suspended and removed from the learning environment across the United States. And so here we have a correlation in which Black students are more likely to be suspended. But in research that we've done, we've been able to pinpoint processes by which this can happen. And one of them is one in which a student's Blackness increases the likelihood of them being seen as a troublemaker. And in turn, if any child or student is seen as a troublemaker, a teacher or an administrator, as another publication here in which we looked at principles, they'll want more severe discipline if it seems like it's more of a fixed thing. This is a troublemaker. This is always going to be a troublemaker. Therefore, we need to act accordingly and remove them from the classroom for the benefit of other students and their safety, things of that nature. If all we knew was the straightforward part, that Black students are more likely to be suspended, it may seem like our only option is to just get rid of people's bias. However, by taking a scientific approach and pinpointing the psychological mechanism by which this happens, we have more options. We can actually cut off other paths in this process. Namely, if any child is seen as a troublemaker, we can reduce the likelihood that the response will be punishment or punitive in nature. And that gels for a lot of practical reasons. for policy reasons. It's not a implicit bias training per se, but rather one that's about empathy, something that everyone can get on board with, something that is generally understood as a good thing that we want, and especially understood for people in professions like education, in which they join the profession to help children learn and grow and become their best possible selves. It's something they can get on board with, which is important when we think about scalability, when we think about policy, when we think about being the change that we want to see in the world. So to put it visually, the status quo is one in which research has shown that we can get that just watching brief silent clips of popular TV shows can increase, for example, our anti-Black implicit bias. That can indeed manifest and then turn into both structural bias as well as interpersonal or bias in our mindsets and how we interact with one another. In the education context, with the research, or I guess I should say my research has shown, is that that plays out in the way I just described, leading Black students to be more likely to be seen as troublemakers, and that their misbehavior being seen as more likely to be a part of a pattern. And in turn, we see more severe discipline for them. And then over time, and this is an important part, because in these contexts, it's not a one-on encounter, like a police officer that runs in with a person that might have a gun, and it's the first time and the only time that there's an interaction. Instead, teacher-student relationships are relationships that exist over the course of many weeks, many months. And so it can enter into what we call a recursive cycle or feedback loop, or a snowball effect, in which small things can ultimately become large things. Typical approaches try to get rid of bias early, but like I've shown and most recent research reflects, is that that doesn't quite do it. And then ultimately, we can still see the same processes taking place. This sidelining bias approach is one in which, given that people may be biased, there may be different types of bias, different levels of bias, but how can we cut it off such that it doesn't actually lead to inequity? Ways that I've thought about this and work I did in generating the idea with Carol Dweck, I was thinking about it in a growth mindset type of way, and she's given me license to say this is the new frontier of mindset work. And that's the idea that you think about the growth potential of another person, think about their humanity, and think about, in this case, their children, and they're learning and growing. And so if they misbehave, that's not an indictment of their character, but rather very situational. It's very much based on what's going on, and it's actually an opportunity to get in there and help that child to confront and navigate what life is bringing them. But then also the empathy part of understanding another person's perspective. And so I don't say perspective taking, which is a typical phrase, but instead perspective giving, which is more active, in which you actually ask someone what they're feeling, what they're thinking, what's going on, as opposed to just assuming or imagining what they might be experiencing. And that ultimately that can lead to improved discipline outcomes. And so I just summed up 2 60-page theory papers that my lab has come out with. So forgive me if I oversimplified this, but I'm going to jump right to the data and hopefully leave enough time for question and answers, and make sure that we all leave this empowered with more information that can help us in our everyday lives. And so the first is one in which my lab has run randomized controlled trials. For those of you who don't know, that's basically how we know whether vaccines work or not. You have a control group and a treatment group, and you randomly assign people to one or the other. And that allows us to establish that there was causation involved. And when it's a field experiment, that means we left the lab and we went out into institutions and gave it the test of, in the real world, might this make a difference? And that's a consistent theme or approach across the 3 different projects I'll talk about. And we put together this series of online exercises that teachers could complete. It took about, I think on average, they took like 30 minutes for them to complete. We did this on purpose because we were interested in scalability from the onset. And so Teachers could do it during their off period. They could also do it from their couch on a Saturday, as long as they had an internet connection. And again, at the risk of oversimplifying, it was laced, very powerfully laced, with a lot of things that are well understood in social psychology, like cognitive dissonance, persuasion, things that have come to be known as behavioral economics, to create a situation in which what is most likely to come to someone's working memory in the heat of the moment is empathy, as opposed to ambiguity. And we first ran this here in California, across 3 school districts. I believe that one was about 2,000 students that those teachers served. And that cut suspension rates by 50% for the entire school year. And so we're not talking about one-on encounters. We're not talking about 5 minutes or 10 minutes. We're talking about an entire school year. And we're talking about a 50% reduction. And so that chart that I showed earlier that had all the dots and everything on it, and I said 0.3 was the minimum. This effect would be off your screen, probably out of your room and in your neighbor's house. This is huge. And it's really huge because it's solely psychological. We are not telling teachers not to suspend students, so it's not a policy approach. We are not teaching teachers new ways of approaching their pedagogy or the curriculum, so it's not skill-based. It's solely about the mindset. And I think, it's a longer conversation. That says something about what the default was before this happened, that something that's targeted can have this type of effect. However, since being at Berkeley, we stepped it up a notch and ran it in a much larger and more diverse sample. That sample I just showed you with a 50% reduction in suspensions was mostly Latinx, Latino, Latina. And so it's proof of concept that it would work to mitigate suspension rates for students that are at a high risk of being suspended. Here, we worked with one of the 10 largest school districts in the United States because the US Department of Education recommended this approach as the best way to mitigate discipline problems across the country. And so we had a lot of districts that were interested. And so I chose a very large district for statistical reasons and things that will become more apparent in a moment. But that's the landscape. And so we're in the field. It's across 20 middle schools, across 17 cities. And what we found was that with this approach, it mitigated the racial disparity in suspensions by 45%, like I mentioned earlier. However, what I didn't mention is that it also surgically was beneficial for students, not just by race, but stigmatized in other ways and the least likely to receive empathy by default. And so students with a history of misbehavior are the most at risk of, again, getting in trouble or being suspended. It was particularly effective for them. And also students who were eligible for special education. They are at a heightened risk of being removed from the classroom. They are at a heightened risk of suspensions, and it mitigated the disparity there, almost making it non-existent. The most promising part of this particular project, to me in our lab, is that this time we were able to track data for an entire second school year and see, the duration of this thing and be thinking about things like dosage. What we found was that with this one dosage, 30-minute, very targeted intervention, the effects persisted into a subsequent school year. And so to be clear, this means that if a student had one teacher who received this treatment, they were less likely to be suspended that entire school year. And then the next school year, when they had new teachers who hadn't received the treatment, they remained less likely to be suspended. And so the promising thing about that is that it leads us to believe that we're tapping into something developmental, that it's changing what education might mean to these students, what the school environment might mean for these students, and that the mitigation and the racial disparity can be sustained across context or types of relationships or interactions. And so then quickly, because again, I want to wrap this up and get to as many questions as possible. We looked at juvenile detention, namely what happens when children are released from prison or jail and going back to school. Can we decrease the likelihood that they'll return to jail? Well, we ran an experiment with this same type of approach, working with the Alameda County Juvenile Detention Center, in which we approached or introduced ourselves to youth as they were released from jail, spoke with their parents, brought them on board, and they were randomly assigned to one of three conditions. A control condition, which those skills are important, which they are. A treatment, so it's a conservative control. A treatment condition that was about students still having a sense of belonging, such that they're not just a statistic or they're not just a criminal, but rather they do indeed belong in society at large. And then a last condition in which it was that same treatment. However, we also asked the youth questions about what would you want an adult at your school to understand about you, so that you can have a relationship that can take you to the next level and get you to your goals. And then we put that into a template and delivered that to that adult at their school. And so that last condition is the key one, in which they're sidelining bias. In this way, it's sidelining bias against people who have been incarcerated or previous offenders, or however that is phrased. And that, here's an example of that letter. We literally took what they told us. We asked them questions that would tell us about who they are as humans, as students. What are their desires? What are their goals? And we strategically put that in a letter. I could spend and I do multiple lectures talking about this letter and how you have to frame things to realistically shift a mindset or refocus a mindset. But then embedded in there are indeed what those students said. This cut the recidivism rate in half, or more than in half. It also significantly reduced the likelihood that these students were suspended from school. And so it seems to be pretty effective. Last was looking at adults who have been incarcerated and were then, or have been sentenced and were then on probation or parole. In this work, I worked with one of the 10 largest cities in the country and worked with all of the probation and parole officers throughout that city. It was about 200 officers, and those officers served approximately 20,000 people on probation and parole across this major US city. And taking a similar approach, very scalable online program that was centered around more of an empathic mindset, led to a 13% decrease in recidivism rates over the course of 10 months. And so over the course of like a year, it also decreased the likelihood of violations to the terms of a person's parole. And so a key thing across all of these is that the actual gatekeeper or entry point was the person who might have the potential to be biased. And that by shifting or refocusing that mindset, it led to a better outcome. It did for them, and that's all the conversation, but it led to a better outcome for the people who they were serving, the people that they were supervising. And so it really speaks to the psychological prowess of this type of approach, that it can, similar to Bob's research looking into, I can't stop thinking about that. I'm going to talk to you more about that, Bob. But that you can think about an individual and what's going through their mind, and that the effects or the impact of what you're doing can be beneficial for the tens of thousands of people that they serve, for example, makes it very strategic, very scalable, very politically correct. We didn't call anyone racist. We didn't point a finger at anyone as the source of the problem. Even though people harbor biases, it wouldn't necessarily be productive to approach with that, but rather to think about the situation and how everyone can win. And so with that, I'll end with a thank you to all of the people in my lab here at Berkeley, as well as colleagues at other universities. This list includes graduate students and undergraduate students at publication with the probation and parole officers. The second author was an undergrad in my lab. She's phenomenal, Kimmy. But yes, thank you for sitting through my spiel, and I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jason. We do have some questions. I know we're a little bit past time, so hopefully those who can stay will stay, and those who can't, thank you for joining us. One question, Jason: do our laws legislating political correctness help or hinder the effort to sideline bias?
Fortunately, they aren't. The scientific jargon is heterogeneity. In what type of situations might this type of approach work? And putting it more specifically to this question, for example, a school district that has policies in place that are against critical race theory or against political correctness, or that they're for it, might this type of approach be effective in either one of those? That's the direction that we're going in now. We just received funding to look into that. It's going to require a huge amount of schools across the country to have a large enough sample to, do randomization at the school level. However, what we've already found, given that we've replicated it across multiple contexts, is that it doesn't seem to make a difference. Probably because it's sidelining bias. It's not even, race wasn't even brought up in any of these materials. Disability status was not brought up in any of these materials. It is in of itself, quote unquote, politically correct. It also serves the purpose that everyone can get on board with. However, as a scientist, I only can really definitively say something based on the numbers, and we don't have those yet, but I would hypothesize that this would be effect regardless of what those type of laws might be. And that's the objective.
Great. We have time for one more question. Curious whether sidelining bias and reducing bias could work together.
Absolutely. And so it's great colleagues and even a mentor of mine when I was in graduate school that has done that work on looking at ways that we can either give people more of a motivation to control their bias or to indeed get rid of bias itself. And just really quickly, I very much think that it's going to, the best or the most effective and lasting approach will be one in which we strategically integrate multiple approaches with an emphasis on the strategic part. It's not just throwing everything under the kitchen sink at it, but rather having a situation where we bring these different approaches together. Namely, and I've thought about this quite a bit, one in which, for example, you have a psychological approach that opens people's mindsets to putting more tools in their toolkit and being more motivated to want to empathize and figure out ways to empathize. And then they get skill building in which they then get the tools that they can then put in their toolkit. And that if that exists in a situation in which there's policies in place in which people have more time to slow down and have conversations and find out more about each other's perspective, those factors together would probably bring about even larger effects than what we're seeing from this my approach that's solely psychological.
Thank you so much, Jason. We need to bring this event to a close now, part of this 100 years of celebration, and this was really an inspirational set of talks. There's a lot that's been done, there's a lot to be done, and that's great, as Bob put it, for the younger generation to get working and tackle. Thank you so much all for being here and supporting us, and we hope you learned a lot about the research that at least 3 of our faculty here are doing. We're really, really thankful that you were able to make it tonight, and we will be posting the talk. If there are others who want to see it, that'll be available on our webpage. We're going to we'll post it with our 100th anniversary, other kinds of events that'll be on our webpage, and you should look for other events. Coming in the fall, we're going to try to have an in-person event to celebrate our 100th year this year. Thank you once again to the speakers. Thank you to our development team that helped put this together. And once again, thanks so much to all of you for being here, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.